Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of the Orthodox Nationalist. This is Matthew Raphael Johnson, and it is the 11th of August, 2021. As always, I want to thank my donors and supporters. As things get worse and worse for us, people like me are absolutely in desperate need of assistance. I've been, as many of you know, removed from every institution solely due to ideological reasons over the last 20 years. And, of course, now university campus is simply out of the question for someone like me. It was barely in the question 20 years ago. And as always, I thank you guys, and I appreciate anything more that you can do for me. Today, I want to go back to the roots of this show. When I first got started, the whole purpose of this, the early discovery of the Russian Orthodox monarchy and its connection to nationalism. This is the core and the center of everything. Not only because of the dogmatic truth of the faith, but also its political expression. There is a dogmatic expression of politics as it is dogma in basic theology. I don't know if I've told this story. I've mentioned it on a few other shows, Hitchcock's and a few others. In January of 1995, I finished my master's degree at the University of Missouri St. Louis, and I was getting started at Nebraska-Lincoln. And that January, I had somewhat of a crisis in that I wasn't sure if I was Roman Catholic or Orthodox. And this was I was in my 20s, and this, of course, was a central issue. I mean, I believed in Christ and all that. But it's a big deal, which side of the divide you're on. Because they're two very, very different places. Since I was already, a historian, as I was already familiar with Plato and Aristotle to a tremendous degree, that I was gifted with an incredibly fast reading ability. Now, I knew the lingo in general. I decided that I was going to read everything concerning the faith, roughly from the time of Christ to maybe just before St. Augustine. So, 250, 300 years. And I wasn't going to stop until I received an answer. University of Nebraska, the Love Library, in Section B in the basement is where all of the patristics could be found, all the theology stuff. I began to read these massive volumes. And not just, Orthodox or Catholics too, but also, Gnostics. Certain variations of Platonian paganism, so-called Neoplatonism, and the rest of all of that. Not to mention Judaic works. And I just read and read and read until I almost collapsed. It was nonstop. I did this for 2 years, not quite 2 years. I lost about 40 pounds. I was obsessed. But I wasn't going to stop, and people were worried about me. They said, well, you're going to starve yourself. And I said, what's the big deal? What's more important? And it was roughly around Thanksgiving of 96. So not quite 2 years later. I don't even remember who I was reading. I think it was Tertullian. I don't know. And I just slammed the book shut. And I said, the Greeks have it right. That's the exact phrase I used. Which was unpleasant because I was in the Roman Church at the time. that was 2 years of what can only be called torment. The ridiculous amount of material that I read, until I couldn't focus anymore. So when I slammed that book shut, I didn't believe in the faith. I knew what was true. I came across things that I didn't know existed. Canons and the fathers, that was just the beginning. You have to already know Plato and Aristotle. You have to know the basic language of Greek metaphysics and maybe the basic history and politics of the time. Obviously the Old and New Testament. That has to be your background knowledge to even begin reading this stuff. But it was so overwhelming, a sense of mission, and to the point where I really was getting sick nonstop. I was doing the classwork never was more than 5% of my time anyway. So that's how I came to Orthodoxy. And no, I've never done that with anything else to that extreme extent. But this massive amount of reading material brought me to the royal family, to Holy Russia. A bit after, roughly around this time, maybe a bit after, in a different context. And that, I always go back to that era, which I look back very fondly on now. I remember the cramps I had carrying these huge volumes from the library to my apartment on Vine Street in Lincoln. God, I mean, I was even known. People thought I was nuts, but I was respected. This is what I was doing there after all. In order to be convinced of something, I have to read myself into it in great detail. And this is my soul after all. What could be more important than my soul and those around me? This is the most important question you could ever come across. And yet people with almost no knowledge or no ability, not even able to comprehend the questions, let alone the answers, are betting their souls on whatever's right in front of them, or nothing. I mentioned that. It's one of my favorite stories. I've been telling it for a long time. I'm probably understating it. But this is, to some extent, an analysis of some of the literature on Imperial Russian historical works. And I wrote a paper in 2012, and as always, I forgot about it, in April of 2012. And I'm not sure if I published it or not. The title is Light at the End of the Tunnel, Trends in Imperial Russian History, Historiography. And, in essence, contemporary historians, they're rethinking the old cliches about Imperial Russia. The ridiculous assumptions that I've been tearing apart on this show in my life have begun to fall apart. Revisionist literature is becoming the norm in Russia. And it's slowly seeping into to a highly specialized, especially ethnic writers. The older, the pro-Menshevik position of the American and English establishment, it is being challenged, but it's being challenged maybe for the wrong reasons. But things like the linear view of history, the Whig idea, that every country is becoming, examples of Britain, that has come under attack. And you have a lot of anti-colonial writers, for example, that are challenging these liberal assumptions. So, in the first half of the 20th century, historical work in English on Old Russia was uniformly hostile. There were no exceptions to this at the time. The Russian monarchy was seen as this vicious, bureaucratic, despotic, Asiatic in a negative sense. That's the one time you could use Asiatic and you don't get in trouble for it. Essentially all synonymous. Then the church, to the extent it was understood at all, was perceived as enslaved to the state and supported the royal house in a slavish way. But since the end of the Cold War, I would say, a new generation of historians have come to challenge some of these. So much in academic history is essentially the regurgitation of cliches. Historiography rises and falls on the assumptions that undergird the article or book. And these assumptions really can't be challenged for the sake of a writer, because it can't be challenged on the grounds that it's the basis for the argument. You have to assume logic is true before you then use it. So Edward Said, 1978, wrote Orientalism, which is a book I think everyone should read, because you had this anti-colonial point of view, and through the back door, really, it began challenging the Whig view of history in the old monarchies, whether it be Chinese, Indian, or Russian. But prior to this, the West, in quotes, the West is seen as a hostile colonial power. The one place where that didn't matter was Russia. There, Western colonialism was considered a good thing. It was something to be celebrated, because finally then they're bringing civilization and liberalism to the beleaguered Russian people. So all of a sudden colonialism is not a terrible thing in that particular case. During the Crimean War and afterwards, as I've said many times, Russia was this black spot on the American historical establishment's plate. They didn't understand it, and they simply used Western liberal cliches and simply applied it to Russia or anywhere else. The opium wars in China had the exact same problem. They all want to be Englishmen deep down. And so liberalism and capitalism is something they have to be exposed to, and they'll take off the shackles of their oppressors. And in that case, colonialism is not a bad thing. Colonial empires were based not on Christianity, but on progress. Now, of course, profit had a lot to do with it. It's certain, like the Russian Empire was not based on profit. It was based on protection. It was a security buffer. But for the British, the Portuguese, the Dutch, these empires were economic. These were financial. And those empires, because they're bringing a new way of life to these people, were seen as progressive. And whether they like it or not, the Marxists have always had to support this. Because the Marxist theory says that the old feudal traditional systems, so-called medieval systems, not just in Europe but in the world, have to be overthrown by capitalism before Marxism can take over. They all have to do that. Therefore, colonialism has to be a good thing. That's a very tough logical conundrum for them, and they really can't get out of it. Capitalism was seen as a revolutionary force because it destroyed the traditions of a people, not to mention national borders and different languages and religion. Therefore, once all that's destroyed, you have this massive productive capacity. Now the communists can come over, take over, and run things their way, in a very simplistic way. So therefore, colonialism, as far as the third world is concerned, is absolutely a good thing. Karl Marx fully supported British colonial aims in Russia and Central Asia. So the colonial empire of the 18th, 19th century, even before then, was a liberal enterprise. It was about progress. They were bringing science and linear logical thinking, which is actually the very definition of logic, to these poor souls in the third world. Of course, the issues these are of tremendous importance. So the historical work on Russia, especially after World War II, did nothing but stress the negative elements in imperial history. The work of this era painted old Russia as inherently, almost to the extent that Bolshevism was inherent to the Russian idea. It just had to be released through secularism and violence. Why they like Peter the Great. What I'm trying to say is that history is often written, especially in that era, with the eye to making the revolution seem inevitable and natural, rather than an alien imposition. So the white state, or the provisional government, was seen as the height of Russian progress. Don't forget, and it's very easy to forget, that the USSR, Leninism and Stalinism in the Soviet Union as well as China, was seen as a wave of the future. It was very fashionable in this era, before, during, and after World War II. Stalinism was seen as the great progressive force. He was a liberator. An incomplete list would include people like Ernest Hemingway, who supported Stalinism and thought this was a great thing. John Steinbeck, Pablo Picasso, Dorothy Parker, Lincoln Stephens, John Dos Passos, Lillian Hellman, Sidney and Beatrice Webb, just to name a few, that saw Stalin and those around him as a progressive, liberating force for mankind. I've mentioned before the Holocaust denial literature as it concerned Stalin was fashionable in the 1960s and 70s in American universities. As they're defending the North Vietnamese in the Vietnam War, it made a lot of sense to all of a sudden discover that Stalin wasn't a bad guy. They never thought Stalin was a bad guy. So if you're trying to defend the Bolshevik takeover and the destruction of the provisional government, which, by the way, the white armies were supposed to be defending, you have to paint the Tsar in the worst possible colors. But thanks to this anti-colonialist point of view, it really comes from Said's book, you have these revisionist ideas coming out of nowhere. It's almost leftist in a very broad sense. They didn't see this coming. They didn't see that this could be used to destroy the old assumptions about the monarchy. It was not meant to do that. Liberals have a tough time with deconstruction and postmodernism when it's pointed at themselves. Postmodernism was something that, for the liberal mind, was often a bad thing. To deconstruct something is great if you're attacking a medieval regime or something that they consider conservative. The problem is that they were turning on leftism as well, because it's based on this linear idea, the Whig idea of history, this linear idea of ancient, medieval, modern, and everyone's moving towards, the end of history, of liberal capitalism. And as I said, I don't think they saw this coming. And so because of works like Orientalism, institutions, whether it be the Chinese Empire, India, or Tsarism, are beginning to be seen differently. Now that stopped, and it shouldn't surprise anybody, that stopped with the rise of Vladimir Putin. Now, after 1990, it was pretty clear what the USSR was. All the records came out. The establishment left were, at least it should have been, absolutely humiliated. They were defending genocide all over the world. Now, I think most of them knew it. I just gave you a very brief list. But there's so many others. Bertrand Russell, Dubois. I mean, it's just, especially the Ivy Leagues in America back then saw Stalin as this great harbinger of universal progress. But once it became clear what these governments were, if there was any kind of open discussion, these guys would have lost their jobs for defending this horrific system and lying about it, openly lying about it. But that didn't happen. Tenure, big money, the big foundations, and general fear of young professors who wanted tenure very badly, and of course the controlled press, really made any reckoning impossible. So there was a reconsideration of Tsarist history that quickly came to an end when Putin took over. He has defended the monarchy in the past, and Putin has many times referred to the Bolshevik Revolution as Jewish, or at least mostly Jewish. But it just goes to show how slavish the academic historians are towards the foreign policy aims of the U.S. government and the corporations that control it. But this only refers to nationalism, never Marxism. I'll never tire of saying this. Mao Zedong, Stalin and his successors were slaughtering tens of millions of people. There were no sanctions on these countries. The historical establishment would attack as a McCarthyite reactionary anyone who challenged it. They not only rejected the Vietnam War, they supported the North Vietnamese, coming both from Mao and Stalin. Mao's role in North Vietnam has not been fully, at least in the popular mind anyway, not been fully analyzed. It has been for specialists, but these are both a Maoist and a Stalinist movement, not in all throughout the Third World. They knowingly supported mass genocide, so long as it supported leftist aims. The minute any kind of religious nationalism comes in, the national Han state in China, Vladimir Putin in Russia, whether it be nationalism or Eurasianism, any anti-liberal, anti-leftist sense of civilization automatically then leads to what they call a new Cold War. Now, there was never an old Cold War. But now you have sanctions. Now you have constant attacks on these countries as countries, not just a ruling class. And suddenly you have these brutal, calling the Russians Asiatic is fashionable as this negative attack on Tsarism. Woodrow Wilson did the same thing in his era. So wherever nationalism or Eurasianism and some kind of third way is concerned, these all of a sudden now they're screaming for war. The war party now, as I've said many times, is the left. It's always been the left. But during the so-called Cold War, there was a faction of the establishment that wanted war against the communists, many of that coming straight out of Trotsky. So the minute Putin began putting Russia on a new footing, a lot of this new accumulation of literature stopped. Now, one example is the relation of church and state. The Orthodox Church in Russia was the closest to the common population, and probably the institution identified with all Russia. There's almost a universal ignorance of orthodoxy, especially the old belief, in the American Academy. These are vaguely liberal postmodernists living in big cities, making $500,000 a year with very little criticism, going to sit down and tell you all about rural Russia in the 18th century. It's absurd. But the literature often doesn't show the same venom towards the old belief as it did the official church. And this is largely because the old belief was seen as a battering ram against the crown. But in general, the Orthodox Church, and they use that word very vaguely, has always been depicted in the Anglo-American world as enslaved to the royal house and useless as a moral force or even a political force. Even that has been tremendously challenged. As we've mentioned before in a different context, what Buddhism is to the Dalai Lama and their challenging of the Chinese state, you do have people making that parallel with the old belief in old Russia. People like Gregory Fries, myself, of course, Vladimir Moss, who I have my own issues with, we've laid out a newer and more accurate picture of the church, and especially uncovering this activism and populism that the church began to, was seen to have been dedicated to for centuries. The common good was its primary goal. So you have very few historians. Very few of them are Christian, let alone Orthodox. And overwhelmingly, the tenured class bases their opinions on third-hand sources and caricatures. Now, Moss and me, of course, we're not based on publishing in major presses. But even the idea that the church as a concept has changed. The term is used by most of the Anglo-American historians as very vague. And because it's so vague, it's useless as a descriptive entity. It could refer to the Synod of Bishops, the International Church of all Orthodoxy in different places. It can refer to the common people. It can refer to the actual church building. It can refer to the faith itself as a set of doctrines. The monastic, when you use the word church, it can refer to any or all of those things. Today, the old institutional point of view has gone away, and now it's seen more of this body of believers rather than a group of bishops in a capital city. The notion of the church being the same thing as bishops has began to be challenged as well. So it's being challenged all over the place. Today it's seen more of the body of the church itself. But the idea of the synod has been a common view of the church for decades in the 20th century. That's a big revision because the church is no longer seen as a centralized institution, but as a highly decentralized, populist and agrarian force. And that force has been completely ignored. So Tolstoy's point of view that Russians didn't support the church, and it wasn't popular, that was simply special pleading and self-interest, almost even wish fulfillment. During the Soviet era, of course, we know the common people came to the defense of the church in huge numbers, which only very recently has been taken seriously by the academic establishment. A lot of the old guard, the tenured hacks need to retire and die. The Bruce Lincolns and all this, that bunch, for a lot of that prejudice to disappear. We even see a few academic pieces defending Optina. The monastic life is this dynamic, populist, and very sophisticated philosophically. But this took decades to leak out. And the white emigres didn't do themselves any favors. They were isolated, most didn't speak English, and the literary establishment considered them fascist. And the so-called anti-communist West usually had their police services hound them wherever they went. So major writers, the emigre movement, like my favorites, Ivan Solonovich, have very lengthy FBI files, meaning they were being tailed by intelligence as suspicious persons. Bolshevik activists were not. The notion that the U.S. government was ever anti-Bolshevik the prejudice still exists, but it's a common falsehood. And it's really based mostly on inertia now rather than fact. But even, younger academics have to admit that Optina received tens of millions of pilgrims throughout the 19th century. So it suggests that the old, that the Russian populist view of the world was Orthodox and monarchist. Finally, this is being taken seriously. Now, the schism of the old belief, and I have a book, as you know, a long time ago, a book on the old believers, took really the most pious of the Orthodox Church, the 1660s, the 1720s. But once Nicholas II came to power, the Church's monastic movement had changed pretty radically. Peter the Great and Catherine had purged the Church to a great extent. It became this westernized institution. This is what the Petrine era did, and it was regaining its traditional footing. The role of St. Paisius Fedotovsky has been reevaluated, and you have an interest in hesychasm, these texts from Athos that were brought into Russia after the dark 18th century there. So the older, the Anglo-American Menshevik view of the Church of this, which was this stagnant set of bureaucracies with no relation to the common population, is increasingly being laid to rest. Not that the people are, Orthodox, but they're seeing it as the general educated opinion in the matter still remains unchanged, but specialized studies have changed things. They've done better in getting to the truth, but these specialized studies are often not available. Saints like John of Kronstadt, Theophan the Recluse, they changed how Western writers treated the church. The Orthodox movement, huge amount of conversions in the Western world, have brought these people to an English-speaking audience. Prior to this, no one had any idea who they were. You had specialists in the biggest Ivy League schools having no clue who these people were decades ago. But, the emigre writers, exiles, rarely learned English. For a long time, the Orthodox Church in exile published only in Russian. Monks like Seraphim Rose, an American convert from California, one of my absolutely central figures in my conversion, began his translating work, and it continues. He died in 1982, but it continues today. But in this period, still so much remains. I had to learn the basic written Russian to get my hands on a lot of this stuff. But some of these saints, as I mentioned, these are both social activists and neo-patristic philosophers, and they were very sophisticated. One of my biggest problems in philosophy departments is how the entire patristic era is ignored. My book coming out on nominalism deals with the church fathers as highly sophisticated metaphysicians, and they all were. Ignoring them is a matter of ideology. They don't want to have them be taken seriously. But even things like the colonization of Alaska and the conversion of thousands of Indians, and how some of these saints innocent of Alaska were venerated and still venerated by that population in that part of the world. The whole notion of an enslaved church and Russian colonization, that's starting to fall apart. Now, after the Bolshevik movement took over, the bankers' revolution, the Orthodox Church went in a few directions. Some of you may know this. First, the exile group set up in New York City as the Russian Synod Abroad. Prior to that, they immigrated in large numbers to Constantinople, Yugoslavia, and different parts of the West. Saints like Philaret and John of San Francisco, Maximovich, completely revitalized the church in the diaspora and brought new converts like Seraphim Rose and Father John Shaw, Bishop Jerome, brought this faith to a completely secular America. Even the Western Rite, the ancient Western Rite in the early Middle Ages, these texts, which have been, no one even knows they exist, now have been given some traction. The second group, the so-called Catacomb Church, is today represented by the Russian True Orthodox Church. It operated secretly in the forests and in homes, like the Old Believers had done for centuries prior to that. And then, finally, this kind of rump organization created by the Soviet regime. You had some decent people trying to have some kind of accommodation here. The so-called Soviet Church was a minority group that was out of touch with millions of devout people suffering after the revolution. It was a ecclesiastical Potemkin village, which didn't have a lot of people and didn't have a lot of functional churches. Unfortunately, it became the official church of Russia, but its primary purpose was to represent the Soviet state at the Rockefellers' World Council of Churches and institutions like that. So what some of the newer literature has been doing, they're not talking about so much the administrative side of the church, which is all they seem to understand before this, but they are concerned with this organic development. The church is increasingly perceived, as it should be, as a group of motivated monks and intellectual laymen, revitalizing the older monastic approach to Christianity, which of course is so essential to Orthodoxy. You had secret monasteries existing all over the place. Sometimes they were masquerading as collective farms. And so a brand new theology was developing, lay monasticism. Sometimes churches without sacraments for a long period of time. That's going to affect theology. It's going to change things for the better. The church was involved in the Anti-Serfdom Campaign before 1861. It was heavily involved in the temperance movement. A social Christianity developed, which is actually very sophisticated, and its assistance to the poor was incredible. It was Metropolitan St. Philaret who wrote the decree that Alexander II put out liberating the serfs. Metropolitan Philaret wrote it. And of course, through the work of Tsar Nicholas II, Nicholas I, thousands had already been transferred to royal or state status, state serfs or royal serfs, which was tantamount to freedom. So by the time the 1861 decree came into existence, it didn't really affect that many people. The Peasant Commune, again, was legally charged with making farming decisions and was the main authority at the local level, with all of its officers elected. It remained the main authority peasants dealt with in Russian history right up until the Reds destroyed it. Now, why a group of socialists would destroy an essentially socialist institution, that's a subject for a different story. But the church was involved with organizing workers at the factory level, and it became so popular that the leftist agitators, who usually had far more money at their disposal, were becoming in second. The left destroyed these institutions as competition. They did what the socialists only promised. Now, as far as the monarchy is concerned, the old slogan was that the Tsar was a despotic, backward, Oriental institution. But a lot of that sloganeering has been blown out of the water. It's sort of like people who are writing against colonialism in Africa, talking about maybe we should look at the old tribal leadership a little differently. Of course, the British and the French are going to condemn it as this backwards serf-holding institution, right? But now, anti-colonialist writers may say that was destroyed by the colonial movement, and therefore we should look at it a second time. You have work starting in the 1980s onward, shows the monarchy and really the Russian mentality by extension in a very different light. Just like in the area of church-state relations, the bureaucratic side of things is not really emphasized. It's the effectiveness of imperial laws and influence in the countryside that matters. Imperial intentions are compared with bureaucratic execution, showing the Tsar as being separated from the people by a bureaucracy rather than his own inclination. Because it's understood that the power of the bureaucracy is perceived as totally separate from the person of the monarch. There was no such thing. Well, there's never any such thing as an absolute monarchy. That's nonsense. It can't be, especially when you didn't have many bureaucrats like Russia had. The Tsar was far from absolute. It was completely dependent on the bureaucracy in St. Petersburg and local governors. And you could see this in isolated but well-meaning Russian Tsars, whose will was only occasionally carried out. Had the monarch's will been carried out in the 19th century, many reforms would have long since been part of the legal tradition of the country. But the Senate, which was created by Peter the Great, which turned out to be an institution of oligarchy, and the bureaucracy in general, is seen as inert. They're the ones who have the bad reputation now, not the monarchy. The monarchy was often at war with these guys. So, for example, Tsar Nicholas I created His Majesty's own chancery. The point of creating that was to confront the bureaucracy, because he wasn't so certain that the Senate and those under them, and the other institutions that were created, were not carrying out his orders, especially in the countryside where communications were already very difficult. The county courts and the commune were the only two legal institutions Russians ever really saw and dealt with. So you had laws against buying and selling of serfs, for example, were never enforced. Local oligarchs were far more important than a Senate in St. Petersburg that really wasn't interested in passing this stuff. The notion of serfdom being slavery is completely illegal throughout the Tsarist empire. But what mattered was the interest of the wealthy in St. Petersburg and in their provisional capitals, regional capitals, not what the monarch wanted. So the notion of the dictatorial czar, which was nonsensical at its best, now you're starting to see this immoral, often powerless monarch at the mercy of bureaucratic elites that you couldn't even dislodge. So even referring to something like the czar's government meant very little. So the czar had its own bureaucratic organization that existed independently of and opposed the Chinoviki ruling in Petrograd. Nicholas I traveled all over the empire. The point of that was to do an end run around the administration, to bring the government to the common peasantry, rather than the other way around. So any concept of tyranny or absolutism had far more to do with clamping down on the Chinoviki, or the, bureaucratic elites, that sometimes had the nerve to refer to themselves as the people, rather than any national policy. The Russian monarch never had anywhere close to the resources at his disposal to be authoritarian. He was a beloved figure, but because of the movement of the move of the capital to the far north, he didn't have the connection with the provinces that he should have. He was a beloved figure, and not just amongst Christians. And when riots broke out, the attacks on local authorities, it was in the name of the Tsar, not opposed to him. But even that, so the bureaucracy itself is perceived differently. So the bureaucracy is understood as this huge, overbearing institution, yet per capita, Russia had the smallest bureaucracy in the world. Rural police didn't really exist, and law enforcement had to be done either by the commune or the volost on the one hand, or the army on the other, only under extreme circumstances. So now, words like government don't make a lot of sense. What are you referring to here? The reality is that Russia contained representative institutions at the local level. And the freeing of the serfs, the reforms of 1861, brought all of these to the provinces and even to the non-Slavic areas of the empire. So the Tsar himself and his own personal administration was only one, but fairly weak and distant, element of rule and authority that wasn't nearly as powerful as the other locally based institutions that came into existence after 1861-62. Now, of course, they always existed, but the great reforms gave them a strong legal backing that, again, destroyed the idea that the Tsar was somehow absolute in the modern Western definition. Even landlords, as I've said many times before, have been rehabilitated. Most of the nobility were small landholders, even in the era of serfdom, that were no better off than peasants both legally and financially. Peasants were often depicted as resisting progressive education and new techniques of farming, rather than being oppressed themselves. The landlords were at the forefront of new ideas. Yet the peasants were stubbornly loyal to the church and the monarchy. The bureaucracy, if anything, was an arm of the left. But this loyalty to the monarchy also meant loyalty to the old ways of doing things. So your typical, low-level noble couldn't just summon the infantry to deal with a peasant disturbance whenever they wanted. So, of course, any noble had to negotiate. I wrote in my very first book, The Third Rome, that peasants were organized into communes, and they always have been. So the old literature, the Anglo-American Menshevik, mid-20th century literature, implies that peasants as individuals were doing battle against the landlords, which is a distortion and a deliberate one. There's no such thing as a peasant family separate from a much larger commune. It didn't exist. To be a peasant was, by definition, to be a member of such an institution, and it magnified his bargaining position. American farmers don't have this kind of protection. American farmers have been driven off their land en masse since World War II. So the notion of serfdom, at its best, was a guarantee of land for peasant families. It was abused in the Petrine era, under the rule of Byron, which was a colonial era. Only then did it become owning of souls. But there is no legal sanction for that. But given the relative weakness of Tsar's power at the era, it was unchecked. So, and we'll talk about these authors here in a minute, but you have a lot of recent scholarship showing the mostly equal distribution of power among the zemstva, commune, volost, and landlord. So the older idea of the despotic landlord, you see in all the Bolshevik writings, that's gone in the same direction as the despotic czar. Things are always far more complicated than those one-liners. They always are. The position of most landlords were far more precarious than the peasants that they had working for them. The landlord class was very mixed politically, just like anywhere else. You had liberals, you had conservatives, you had old believers, you had populists. You could find them in the mid and high-level noble class throughout the country. So it implies that had free elections been the norm at the federal level, the ideological vision of the country wouldn't be that much different than the royalist idea in general. So the broader picture is that the Tsar, church, bureaucracy were far more representative than normally presented in the older literature. The government of Russia was multiform. It had complex, it had many layers. Each layer had different agendas and contained people of many different backgrounds. So stupid phrases like despotic or authoritarian, they have more to do with ideological agendas than anything else. Since the 1980s, you have a total revision of the idea of the peasant commune. There's the older idea that the commune was the invention of Alexander II's reforms, but of course no one takes that seriously anymore. The Slavophiles were right. The commune, or the mir, is an institution of antiquity. It changed shape over time, obviously, like anything, but it didn't change its essence. It remained popular, effective, and efficient, right up until the Red takeover. So if you take the commune as the central element of peasant life, it changes Russian rural history entirely, because it shows the peasant being inherently democratic. Local democracy was everywhere, and it developed a politically aware peasantry far more sophisticated than in the West. The collections of 18th century folk songs and folk poetry shows a peasantry far from inert. Their songs show a poetry of great political sophistication, too often either ignored or misunderstood by Western liberal urban historians who have no connection with anything like that. It shows a strongly populist and royalist point of view that was far closer to Popodonostia than Alexander Herzen. Secondly, the landlords and government officials were not able to simply impose their will. I wrote this in my first book, and I'm seeing more and more backing for this as time goes on. The elected elder of the commune needed to be consulted for most, if not all, major decisions. So you have this revision of peasant-landlord relations in the literature of the 80s and 90s to a great extent, as well as peasant-bureaucratic relations. It's being rewritten, thanks to me, and now it's leaking into the academic world, long before Vladimir Moss myself came around. So the old czarist despot stereotype is falling to pieces. This stereotype derives from British propaganda during the Crimean War, and they painted everything Russian as identical to everything backwards and despotic. So, third, the communal tradition was at least as important as the interests of the landlord in terms of local policy. You have more libertarian-style landlords being checked and neutralized by a far more traditionalist peasant commune. So the old literature, to some extent, idealized the peasant as this oppressed, long-suffering democrat, except, of course, for his religion and the entirety of his culture, but they could deal with that later. The peasant was idealized so long as the historian remained more or less ignorant as to his whole culture. But for many generations, Western writers had no idea he even had a culture, so he was easy to idealize. The reality was that the patriarchal relations in the commune were far more conservative than the landlords. And that confrontation was a conservative peasantry and a liberal landlord. The landlord noble class, ideologically speaking, was far more diverse in its political point of view than the old literature suggests. The peasants continued to be perceived as more ideologically coherent with their divisions, probably based on their own connection to the old belief, if nothing else. The last thing you could call a peasant would be inert. Peasantry elsewhere? Very possibly. So you have this huge revision of the historic role of the Russian countryside. The peasants aren't understood as the ignorant hicks that they used to be. But they're politically aware, they're shrewd debaters. So the reforms, that later reform, 1905, 1906, were important. They didn't fundamentally alter the commune. You have recent research talking about the Stolypin reforms, permitting private peasant land ownership, were not really popular with the peasantry. Only the very rich and the very poor were interested in leaving the commune. The commune is an ancient institution that protected the weaker peasants against famine or other emergencies. The commune permitted the state to free itself for any social welfare function. So all this was taken care of at the country or communal levels. I've argued for several decades that the contempt for rural people, you see in the West, in America, the ignorant, toothless, illiterate, having sex with their sisters and methamphetamine and all that, that's something that the regime does to make destroying them and taking their land and giving everything over to the big corporations more palatable. That's where this comes from. We all know that attacking white people is normal and praiseworthy according to the regime, but especially if they're powerless. Black people in the urban centers are worshipped by the regime. They're armed. They're manipulated by CNN. You don't see this at all. You don't have any organization in the countryside in America. But if you paint them as ignorant hicks voting for Trump, you can then justify destroying them at every level. The idea of the West is something else, too. You read people like Dostoevsky or Herzen, the West is reduced to, centralized scientific technocrats imposing their will on this massive immoral empire. But that's as stereotypical as the despotic czar idea. You can't reduce a civilization to these one-liners. That's always your classic sign of the amateur. It's all stereotypes that he kind of took from somewhere. But of course, like everything else, it wasn't as ideologically unified as this suggests. The West has had many communes and as Christian institutions as Russia did. They didn't make foreign policy, but the West is just as multiform as the East. The West is a creation of Gogol's Rome or Dostoevsky's characters, even Turgenev's nihilists. They're philosophical stereotypes. So the West is seen as advanced and Russia's backwards. Well, that's from the same stereotypical vocabulary. That was mostly emotional. Peter the Great created this stereotype, and so did the landlords later on, the Senate, to justify again the destruction of the peasant commune. You need to render them subhuman so you can destroy them. The West was as backwards and agrarian as East. Most of the Western world was agrarian and populated by communes. So really, West and East, you're talking about the policy of empire is not really useful. In my first book, The Third Rome, I take aim at words like backward. It is so saturated with ideology that it's worse than useless for historical analysis. Backward relative to what? What is the goal that these people are refusing to recognize or achieve? What is the backward aspect of this? The Western progressives controlled the money, that's true, but they were a tiny urbanized middle-class minority. They saw their own people in the West as backwards. They'd simply impose that on Russia as a whole. They still do. And it's this stereotype view that turned ardent Westernizers like Alexander Herzen against the Westernization project in the Russian Empire, of course imposed from above. So over time, West meant bourgeois in Russia, at least because that was the group that made most of the decisions that mattered in foreign affairs. Even words like progress, again, something I've taken aim at, a lot of people have. And progress has been destroyed really by anti-colonialist writers too. The older generation of English writers on Russian history just saw Russia's political and economic evolution as just slightly slower than the West. Because everyone's moving towards English parliamentary institutions, right? The Whig assumptions is based on the idea that all nations, at least all European nations, exist to develop institutions identical with the British. Progressive, secular, liberal. If they didn't, there was something wrong with the society, and it had to be fixed by the empire, and that was the ideological purpose of the empire. So the idea today is that Russia, under very different circumstances than the British, could be expected only to follow its own path. The British Empire didn't automatically provide the standard that Russia was to follow. It's hard to see it set the standard for anything. The concept of backward is used against British democratic Darwinian capitalism as a default standard of the elite. But that's an arbitrary and questionable standard even at the best of times. Even definitions of success, progress, prosperity. You can't talk about these terms without defining those. Dostoevsky parodied all of these definitions in Notes from Underground, one of my favorite works of Russian literature as a whole. But the main problem with the Anglo-American literature in history is that it assumed that the Western European development was the norm for the world. Today, that's the view of the World Bank and most departments of economics today. But it can't be translated to foreign contexts effectively. And it's actually the very definition of colonialism, minus, of course, the armies. So the broader problem that more recent work has been forced to face is the applicability of terms that developed in Western Europe to Russia and Ukraine. So these have revolved mostly around symbolic meanings far more than functioning institutions. Institutions are obtuse ideas that they don't express the mentality of the people operating within them. In a society dedicated to progress, they must always be behind the times, since ideas change much faster than institutions do. So the meaning of the institutions is far more important than the institutions themselves. So to assume that the royal bureaucracy in Petersburg operated according to the same basic egocentric motives as the London bureaucracy is no longer, this is not a historical method. It's easy, but ideas and symbols differ because Russia differs from Europe in almost every respect. Government is not the same in Petersburg as it is in London, and the very concept of words like state or political or success or legality is open to question across languages and boundaries. Royalism doesn't define terms like the political the same way that oligarchic republics do. To the extent that society is republican, the weaker local institutions seem to be. But the reason it worked, and it developed in Western Europe, was in a very different context. It became fungible for all societies. Since, as is well known, there was no Enlightenment era in Russia, the concept of what falls under the political is very different. Terms like, abstract rights or the will didn't function in Russia because the whole concept of the state is not the same. This literature, and I'm talking about, a lot of the newer works, Orientalism, Nationalism, and Ethnic Diversity in Late Imperial Russia, from V. Tolles, 2005. C. Reed, In Search of Liberal Tsarism, Historiography of Autocratic Decline. S. Hawk, Disease and Mortality Patterns in Paris and Borowska, Russia, came from Population Studies. S. K. Marcy, The Economy of Nerves, in 2010. J. Bradley, Pictures at an Exhibition, Science, Patriotism, and Civil Society in Imperial Russia, came out in the Slavic Review in 2008. P.W. Rogers, Compliance or Contradiction, Teaching History in the New Ukraine, came out in 2007. Even S. Hedlund, Vladimir the Great, Grand Prince of Muscovy, Resurrecting the Russian Service State, came out in 2006. And even broader terms like the Gregory Fries, always one of my favorites, especially his stuff in 2010. But of course you had the bad guys. W.B. Lincoln, Sunlight at Midnight, St. Petersburg and the Rise of Modern Russia, is almost completely unreadable. Came out in 2000. This isn't history. It's infantile. Mark Rafe, Understanding Imperial Russia, State and Society in the Old Regime, came out in Columbia University Press, 1982. Again, almost completely unreadable. Nation and State in Late Imperial Russia, T.R. Weeks, in 2008. these aren't works of history. But that's a different generation. The works I just mentioned have slowly but surely begun to change some of this stuff. And you could use anti-colonialism as a kind of cover for understanding that these old definitions that come from the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks are collapsing. Remember just how close Marxism is to the Enlightenment. Marx saw himself as the fulfillment of the Enlightenment, as did Lenin and Stalin. That generation is going. That generation is long gone, actually. But the ideology still remains. So there's a certain chaos now in certain places in academic and even popular history. Yeah, the History Channel still hasn't caught up yet, but anyone who watches that deserves what they get. It's extremely important to realize a certain chaos has been introduced in this. Western colonial ideas are, we get words like, progress and backward and ignorant and even illiterate. This is completely, this is not justifiable as history anymore. And this is why specialized studies are so important, because you have to know this literature backwards and forwards to begin even to start talking about these vocabulary. We use these terms all the time. We think it's simple, reason or law or right or even church. And we assume we know what we're talking about. And in different contexts, these words mean very different things. Anyway, everyone, I really appreciate you listening as always. Thank you for putting up with me. I appreciate all you do. I appreciate all your support. And I will talk to you next time. Bye-bye.